Jeepers, why is this microphone so tall? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Old Cowtown Museum. This is our final in our winter lecture series. We hope that you have enjoyed the variety of things that we've had this year. The first couple of years, we did more thematic things, and we drew a particular crowd. We tried to draw a wider section of audience with different types of talks. So we've had bicycles and women's breast reform and prohibition, and today firearms. So hopefully that'll pique some of your interest. If you have any thought about something that you would like us to address, we are always looking for new topics, especially topics that you're interested in. And don't hesitate to drop by with Henson whenever you're leaving, just a suggestion or two. We definitely appreciate it. So, all right. We do have some refreshments over there, coffee, tea, water as well. So today we've got quite a treat. We have Todd Reifschneider, who is one of our volunteers with the gunfight group, and he is quite the aficionado of firearms. And to be honest, whenever he said he wanted to do a talk about guns on the grounds, I was like, okay, yeah, I suppose. But the drama behind history, I don't know how I could have said there's no drama. There's all kinds of drama in history. So anyway, so Todd's going to walk us through some of the firearms that were popular of the period, as well as some of the mysteries and histories that are behind them. So without any further interruption, give Todd a hand. Welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. As Anthony said, volunteer. Been down here for about 12 years, I think. Volunteer at Cowtown. Hasn't long time. Not as long as some though, but longer than others. So one of the things, as Anthony mentioned, that made me want to start doing this is, as a gunfighter, one of the things that we get asked quite a bit is, can we take our gun out of our holster so we can take a look at it? Well, no, we're not allowed to do that. And so I thought, why not give a talk on the guns? Put them in a controlled environment where they can get up close to see them, and we can talk about some of the history. Well, in digging into and researching some of the history, there are some fascinating stories that preceded and went through all the firearms. Now, quick little background on myself. My father was a large gun collector and a gunsmith. He didn't do that for a living, he did it as a hobby, but I literally grew up in the gun culture. That doesn't make me an expert, but what it does make me is experience. And for instance, the box that's open up there, and you're welcome to take a look at that later. All these you can come up close and take a look at. That was all completely handmade by my father. Those were special to me because in 1974, I was old enough in his mind that I was actually able to help him craft those guns. So when he passed, that was the first thing I wanted. When Mom said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want those." I have memory there. Okay, so here's what we're going to be covering. We've got shotguns, both muzzle loading and cartridge, rifles, same thing, muzzle loading, cartridge or breech loading, and handguns. Now, the real stories are in the handguns, and I hope you enjoy them. Now, shall we begin with muzzle loading shotguns? Who owned them and why? Plains travelers of the post-war period found big bore shotguns very useful. In 1867, Regis de Troybrand mentioned that I brought from Berthold a double-barreled shotgun for hunting this fall, and hunting paraphernalia, powder flask and bullet sack that I found for sale at Gustav's. The weapon to see seemed to be a good one, although it didn't cost very much. And I suspect that this is an English weapon, which paid no duty at the frontier. Now, taking note of the lawlessness in Cheyenne in the early 1868, James Chisholm wrote, "The condition of the town is very unsettled. The vigilantes are abroad, and there may soon be a necessity of putting the city under martial law. I am rooming with the U.S. Marshal of the territory, and we have each to keep a double-barrel shotgun at the head of our couch, besides revolvers." Then, when Richard Townsend came to Colorado a year later, he bought a Settler's double gun by W.W. Greener of Birmingham. This was a muzzle-loading smoothbore with 30-inch barrels and a weight of about 9 pounds. And it was made to shoot round bullets 12 to the pound for big game, as well as small shot and buckshot. Though a trifle heavy, it served its purpose well. Now, modern shotguns shoot a 1-ounce slug very effectively with a whole lot of power. I did the math. That's 1.3 ounces. That is a massive round ball. Had to have been out of a 10 gauge, just had to have been. But that is a huge chunk of lead flying through the air. Later, involved in conversation with a talkative frontier dweller, Townsend described his gun. "Very good thing to have too sometimes," the frontiersman said with the air of a wise judge, "but a shotgun's not very handy at close quarters, unless it's sawed off. For fighting in a bar, let me tell you, or on top of a stagecoach, they like to cut the barrels off a foot in front of the hammers, so the gun handles more like a pistol." So these are some very interesting things. Now, this is, I found very interesting as well. The availability. Shotguns were such saleable items on the post-war frontier that even business establishments, ordinarily having nothing to do with firearms, sold them. In November 1869, for example, Finch's Saloon of Gold Hill, Nevada advertised wines, liquors, shotguns, powder flasks, powder shot, and caps. For many years after the war, even when the cartridge arms had almost completely displaced muzzle-loading rifles and pistols, the muzzle-loading shotgun remained in common use as late as 1884. They were being listed in sales ads. You can see here a picture of the flyer for Finch's Saloon, mentioning the shotguns and flasks. Very interesting. So the muzzle-loading shotguns went well into the 1880s and 1890s. Now, this beat-up old relic right here is a muzzle-loading shotgun. This is a 10-gauge muzzle-loading shotgun. It's a little beat up. I've been commissioned to make a new hammer for it and try to get this to be a functioning firearm once again. I told the gentleman that gave me this to work on, he can't afford me, but he gave it to me anyway. So we'll see what this one is all about. This one is a W.M. Moore company. Very old. There are, and I think one of the reasons why the muzzle-loading shotguns were so popular is they had a powder flask that had a direct measure of the powder. They also had a flask that had a direct measure of the shot. So with that, you could pour the powder down the barrel, put a wad in, pack that in, pour the shot in, pack that in with another wad, and you were ready to go. Put a cap on it for your next waterfowl or whatever it was that you were hunting, you were ready to go. They were cheap. You could buy a muzzle-loading shotgun for as little as $2. That's a pretty good deal. Now, we move on to the cartridge or the breech loading shotguns. So until the close of the 60s, the breech loading shotguns had little effect on the muzzle loader's popularity. And in fact, were not even very well known. A reporter for the Missouri Republican describing T.J. Albright's display at the St. Louis Fair in the fall of 1868 wrote, "A breech loading shotgun, which is a curiosity here and which is valued at $300, awakens general comment." I said, who had $300 to spend on a shotgun? But there were 4 American manufacturers that were trying to get into the market which the British owned. And that was Ethan Allen, Daniel Wesson, Eli Whitney, and the Parker brothers. They were working so hard. Only one of these 4 would be successful, the Parkers. They were a general manufacturing firm, entered in business in the 1830s. They made coffee mills, vices, similar hardware. Didn't take steps in firearms until 1863 when they took a government contract for 15,000 Springfield rifles, the muskets. Successful completion of that gave Parker a taste for the gun business, and working with William Miller, Parker presented a patent for a double barrel breech loading shotgun. Wasn't especially noteworthy as far as design goes, but it was well made. And it would sell for the low price of $50. If it was better finished, $75. So here's an example of a Parker shotgun. This one happened to be owned by Wells Fargo Company. They bought an awful lot. Next slide. There we go. I thought I hit the button. Thank you. So here it is, and it has the Wells Fargo and Company logo down underneath where the barrels would go. So they were fairly popular, but even with moderate success, American manufacturers still came in behind the English manufacturers. Although Parker could retail for $50 in its unadorned version, it could cost $200 or more in its superior finish, which would be scroll work and all of that on it. Well, if a buyer was willing to spend that for a shotgun, they just bought a British one because they were better made. Bottom line. So the British kind of invaded the shotgun industry in the United States and owned it until the turn of the century thereabouts. And the American manufacturers caught up in popularity. Colt had a big deal to do with that later on, but so did Remington. But for the most part, the Brits had that. So here is an example of a double-barreled breech loading shotgun. Put your rounds in, close it, cock the hammers, you're ready to go. This one happens to be one that's a little older, but still breech loading shotguns of this kind all look the same for a long time. I picked this up yesterday at the gun show. It's good fun. It's got Damascus barrels. It's very pretty. So it caught my eye and I needed it.
You heard me say I needed it, right?
It spoke to me, okay? Muzzle loading rifles. Boy, as many as there were muzzle loading shotguns, there were as many muzzle loading rifles. Lots of muzzle loading rifles, the Springfield muskets. After the Civil War, the soldier could buy his musket from the government for a tune of $9. A lot of that happened. A lot of them got turned in. So this would be an example of the Springfield musket that was used in the Civil War. This happens to be mine, because I do some Civil War reenacting from time to time. Brake rifle, 58 caliber, load from the muzzle in, cap it, fire it. Good stuff. But an example of a civilian style would be this guy. Now, I can't tell you any particular name that this rifle is, because this was also built by my father by hand from scratch. He knew a guy that had a barrel making lathe, and he would make barrel blanks. I was this big and going with Dad and watching that. I don't remember much about the machine. So anyway, but this would be something that would be carried as well. And this is a 45 caliber, and it takes 70 grains of black powder. So fairly hefty. And so that's an example. And like I said, there are tons. When you start trying to do research on muzzle loading rifles, it's like, where do you begin? There are so many. There's not enough time in the day to cover them all. So I'm not going to try. Now, breech loading rifles. However, there's some interesting stories here. Let's start off with the Spencer carbine. Christopher Milner Spencer. He came up with that rifle and this design in 1859 and went in production with that in 1860. Interesting note with this, this was one of the very first, or is one of the very first repeating lever action rifles. The rounds went in through the butt of the rifle up into the gun there, and when you opened the lever, it would chamber around when you closed it back. Now, if you had fired a shot, it would eject out the top, and when you closed it, it would put the next round in. This was a 50 caliber gun. Now, Spencer was very, very interested in wanting, when the Civil War broke out, he really wanted that to be used in the war. So he got a hold of the War Department and told them about this gun. The War Department says, we don't want that. It's going to use too much ammunition. We're just going to waste ammo. We don't want that. Well, that wasn't a good answer for him, so he decided to go to Abraham Lincoln. Now, he goes in the White House with rifle in hand and a box of ammunition and walks right past the sentries. They do nothing and walks right in the office of Abraham Lincoln and says, this is the gun you need for the war. Abraham Lincoln says, come back this afternoon. He does. They go out on the mall with some generals and the head of the War Department, and they do a firing demonstration on the Mall of Washington, D.C. Wow. Abraham Lincoln is impressed, and he turns to his War Department general and he says, buy him. Let's get him out there in the field. General goes back to the War Department, says, we're not buying them. We're going to waste ammo. So the war goes on. Lincoln says, where are the Spencers? Well, we didn't want them. I said, buy them. You're fired. Fired the general. And got a new guy in there and says, hey, Mr. Spencer, we want your rifles. Start making them. While war's in, over 100,000 Spencers were in circulation. Very interesting. Can you imagine walking in the White House? That just blew my mind when I read that. It's like, wow. Another very interesting story. Benjamin Tyler Henry. Has anyone ever heard of the Henry rifle? Few have. Interesting. So Henry he was working for another gun company called Volcanic Arms, and he came up with a rimfire cartridge called 44 Henry. Now he perfected this round. Well, I've got this ammunition, I need a gun. So he builds, if you want to get that one, he builds the 60 Henry. Now the 60 Henry, very interesting piece. One of the first popular in use lever action repeating rifle. Cock the hammer itself. The Spencer, by the way, going back a minute, when you cocked that, it didn't cock the hammer, you still had to manually cock the hammer in order to make it fire. This one automatically cocks the hammer. Now to load this one, it's very interesting. You have to slide this all the way up and turn the top of the barrel, and that opens up the tube for you to drop the rounds in. Once you did that, put that back and the spring in there with the rounds and make them go into the elevator, I call it, and work. Now, these were also seen some use in the Civil War. But the 44 Henry rimfire round was a little puny, wasn't good for much over 100 yards. But the Confederates said, that's the gun you load on Sunday and shoot all week, because it held 16 rounds or 17 rounds of ammunition. They'd never seen anything like it. So that's the Henry. Now then, as gun production was going along, Henry was being further and further disgruntled by Mr. Winchester, who actually owned the company, New Haven Arms Company, that was being built, that built the Spencers or the Henrys. And he went to Winchester and he said, I want more money. I'm not being compensated well enough for my invention. Winchester said, big deal. This is business. Move along. So he did. He moved along. So Winchester dissolved the New Haven Arms Company and started Winchester Arms. And this was their first adventure into as a Winchester, based on the Henry's design. Only this is a side gate loading rifle. Still shot the 44 Henry round, but it actually loaded with a side gate and had a nice foregrip here to where you didn't burn your hand when you shot the whole barrel of ammunition out. So everything looks exactly the same, almost identical in the mechanism. So that is Winchester's first really successful breech loading cartridge revolver. This became very popular, very famous. Indians loved it when they stole them from the soldiers that were killed. They really enjoyed this rifle. They called this the Yellow Boy because of the brass. Now the next big, very iconic rifle that Winchester came out with is the 73 Winchester. Looks pretty close to the 66. Pretty much the same mechanism again, side loading. Only this bad boy shot the 44-40 round. Now that was a new center fire cartridge round that had a whole lot more firepower to it. And this one is the rifle that was dubbed the gun that won the West, right here. Everything else exactly the same. I've highly modified this one. The action in this is like glass, and the trigger pull is only 2 pounds. This one shoots in the reproduction world. You can get the 44-40 still. Kind of hard ammunition to get hold of, so this one's 45 Colt ammunition. And let me tell you, this gun is better than the shooter. It goes exactly where you aim it every single time. It's absolute pleasure and joy to shoot. Probably my favorite gun to shoot in my somewhat collection. I have a few guns. I have a well, when you're raised up in the culture. Anyway, now the next one I don't have an example of. The Sharps rifle. Now the Sharps started out also in the Civil War time as a breech loading cap style firearm. You took a linen cartridge that had the bullet and powder in the linen piece. And you pull down the lever and you stick it in there, and when it comes back up, it shears off the back of that piece of linen to expose the powder. And when you fire, then the cap goes through and off it goes. Later, those were adapted to cartridge style guns. And that's where the importance comes in. One movie in particular made the Sharps very popular. If you've seen the movie Quigley Down Under, this is a Sharps. It has the double set triggers. So the first trigger at the base, you pull that sets the trigger. The front trigger is a very fine hair trigger. These were extremely high-powered rifles. The Quigley Down Under gun was a 45 caliber 120 grain case. So a 45 120, that sucker is that tall. Literally. Well, why did they need that kind of power? And they had many other calibers too. The Sharps were converted into 50 calibers, 45 calibers. There's a reason for that and why they became popular, especially in the American West. Buffalo hunting. This is a buffalo hunter's camp near Sheridan, Kansas. You see them seated outside their dugout, both carrying Sharps rifles. Probably the one rifle that did the most damage to the buffalo was the Sharps. It was a big wallop and very efficient and extremely accurate. There were shots quoted out to a mile. So you can still buy that gun today. There's a company called Shiloh Sharps Company. Now you're going to have to pay for that. That's about a $6,000 rifle. But you can get one. You can get the Quigley Down Under one and make it. Definitely have to wait a while. Did you make it? Let's get into the handguns, shall we? Any questions thus far, or comments or corrections of any comments that I've made? You're welcome to. Or we can wait till the end and you can comment. Go ahead.
Was the Sharps the one that they referred to as the Bleacher's Bible during the bloody cases?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
That's right, because I think they were stolen from whatever federal armory there.
Yes. The Springfield Armory
Okay.
at Harper's Ferry,
Yeah.
actually. Yes. Well, you can't talk about handguns unless you talk about this gentleman, Samuel Colt. As a very young man, his father ran a manufacturing company, and he bugged the living daylights out of the guys that worked at the factory. And so Samuel Colt's dad sent him off. While he was on a ship going over to India, and while at one of the ports, he saw a European version of a repeating revolver. But it was very archaic, and it used a fuse, basically, to touch off each of them. You had to manually turn the cylinder, and it was really bizarre and weird. So on the way back, he sits down and carves in wood an idea for a repeating revolver. It's home. Now he's a man, and he's going to go into business. He's going to make his own repeating revolver. So he hired a gunsmith to build his first versions of that. So in 1836, the first real model that actually had any real sales to it was the Patterson model. Now, the Texas Navy bought 120 of these Patterson model revolvers from Samuel Colt. Now he's in business, he has a factory, he gets his first orders. nobody cared. Had very little sales, and he only sold 120 of these to the Texas Navy. No one really cared. Until there was a battle, and the Texas Rangers were fighting the anyway, they were fighting an Indian. Oh, it'll come here in a minute. They're very good horsemen. The Comanche, that was it. Thank you. And the Comanche were laying in wait for these Texas Rangers. The Navy had disbanded and had given the Texas Rangers these Patterson revolvers. They each had 2 revolvers, the Texas Rangers. As they approached the Comanche, they figured that they would dismount, shoot their musket, and try to load, and that's when they would attack. That's how the Comanche did it that's how they defended themselves against firearms. Only guess what? This time that didn't happen. They charged the Comanche with guns in each hand and shot them point blank. The commander said, "Make powder burns on them." After the 60 Comanche had lost half of their men, they turned around and ran. This was the first successful use of a repeating revolver. Now, one of the guys that was involved in that came to Washington. His name was Walker. Samuel Colt by now is bankrupt, almost living a life of poverty, working in a manufacturing company. Samuel Colt hears that this Walker guy is in town and writes him a letter that he'd like to meet with him. So he does. And together, they come up with the Walker. This is a 47 Walker. It's a 44 caliber revolver, repeating revolver, designed by Colt and Mr. Walker. It uses 60 grains of black powder. They wanted something very funky and heavy to match the muskets that they were carrying. So this is what they got. This weighs 4 pounds, 9 ounces. This gun was never meant to carry on your waist. This was actually, they designed a holster to put it in the saddle. There is a surgeon that testified when they were fighting the Mexicans down in Texas with this, that he watched a Mexican soldier get hit by one of these with the same ferocity as the muskets they were firing at 100 yards. Now, the problem with these were at 60 grains of black powder, and they started splitting the cylinders out. So they complained to Colt about it. He goes, load 50 grains in. Practical solution. Now, the big problem with this had is there was no catch, latch for this loading line. So it's always flopping down on them and getting in the way. They always had to they would tie a string here to hold it in place. So it keep it so they could go through the process here. So that's the Walker. The government took a big shining to that and ordered 1,000 Walkers. Samuel Colt was now back in business. He was told that he would make money the likes of which he couldn't even dream. From poverty, they come up with the Walker, and the next big hit is the 51 Navy. Now, the 51 Navy is a 36 caliber repeating revolver. Looks much the same design as the Walker, only smaller, much lighter. This became very popular around the world. Well over 300,000 51 Navies made in the time frame, clear up into the 1890s, they were still being made. Now, one very famous guy that made these things really famous, you may have heard of him, Wild Bill Hickok. He carried a pair of ivory handled 51 Navies in a belt right up here, and they were crossways, they were coming this way, each side. And well documented several times of someone calling them out, and before they could blink their eye, he had them down on the ground with his trusty 51 Navies. So that's the next in the line. Now then, yeah, that one. Next in the series of lines of Colts, Civil War breaks out. The 60 Army. Now this was made by the thousands and thousands and thousands. It's wartime. This was the government's go-to gun, 44 caliber. All the actions in these are based, it's almost identical. Very popular gun. So now Colt is really roaring with, they've got the 51s, they have the 60s running, they have rifles they're making, and Colt's making money. Colt's making a lot of money. Now, unfortunately, he didn't get to see a lot of that because he died in 1864. At the time of his death, Colt Manufacturing Company, arms company, was worth $13 million. And his personal income was $1 million a year. Unfortunately, he didn't, like I said, and he died, guess what he died of? Exhaustion. He worked himself literally to death trying to make this company. I found that sad, don't you think? A couple months later, after his passing, his factory catches fire. They think it was Confederates that did it. They burned down the whole handgun manufacturing line. But somehow the rifle lines survived the fire. But that brought in the next big player in the Cartridge Revolvers. Enter Remington. Now, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Elephant, Remington. He, at the age of 16, was working in his dad's forge as a blacksmith, and he forged a barrel for a gun. And he took that gun that he made from scratch, and the barrel and all, and went to a shooting competition. Now, he didn't win that competition, but he got like second or third place. And by the time he left there, he had orders for those barrels, more than dozens of them. That was his first foray into the firearm business at age 16. He was, at this time, the oldest firearms manufacturer in the United States. So they had a gun waiting in the wings. Now, Colt had held down the patent of the repeating arms for a lot of years. And when the patent was up in like 59 or so, the Remington came out. Now they call this the 58 Remington. That's kind of a misnomer. It actually was released in 61. But when you look on the cylinder, now this is a reproduction, it doesn't have it on there. It'll say patented 1858. So that's why it got the name 1858. Well, now Colt's handgun line is burned down. Guess who gets the benefit of wartime production? The 58 Remington. This gun was produced in the 300,000s all around the world as well. Now, you may have seen a couple of movies, if you like Westerns, where one of the features of this particular firearm was demonstrated. Who likes Clint Eastwood? High Plains Drifter. You see him shooting the bad guys, right? Well, he runs out of ammo, so what does he do? He does this. Takes the cylinder out. Replaces the cylinder back. Now come on, get my fingers to work right. And just like that, you've got a fresh cylinder. Colts couldn't do that. Colts, you have to break the whole gun apart to get the cylinder. So this is a great feature. That's 58 Remington. So that is a really cool feature to have. Militarily, they didn't issue extra cylinders to the officers or any of the cavalry guys. They had to manually reload them like everything else. But civilians, you can bet they carried extra cylinders, especially if you're going to cause trouble. Cartridge revolvers. Oh boy, now here's where the stories come in. You can't talk about a cartridge revolver unless you talk about this gentleman. Interesting character. Roland White. He's working in the Colts factory with his brothers making barrels. Now, Roland White fancied himself as a gunmaker, gunsmith, gun everything kind of guy. Well, he sees in the scrap bin a couple of cylinders, supposedly scrap, and he decides he's got an idea for a gun. So he takes them out, and imagine this being the scrap cylinder that you see from any firearm. You can't see through the back and all this. Chucks it up in his lathe, cuts the back of it off, and now you can see through the cylinders, right? He patents that, but it was part of a gun that he designed to fit in a Colt with one single cap on the top and open design in the back. He thought you could load the paper cartridge in the back of it and it'd seal off and you could fire it that way. But every time you pull the hammer back, you have to stick another cap on. He presented that to Colt. And Colt said, "Get out of here. That's junk. Doesn't make any sense." And that was before Colt passed away. So, Roland White gets a patent for a through cylinder. Now then, anybody that wants to do a cartridge revolver, he holds the patent on it. And not only does he hold the patent on it, he holds two patents. It's basically the same thing. So enter Smith & Wesson. We'll talk about them a little more in a bit. They are chomping at the bit to release a firearm. The Colt patents finally expired after his extension, and they were ready to go. So they got in contact with Roland White. They did their due diligence research and said, "We want rights to your patent." And he says, "Well, what will you do for me?" He said, "We will give you 25 cents for every gun we sell." All right, you got a deal. 25 cents a gun. You're going to sell a lot of guns. And they did. Smith & Wesson came out with their first revolver, cartridge revolver. It was a 22 caliber. And it sold like hotcakes. And here's Roland White rolling in the money, except for one problem. It was up to him to fight all the legal battles with patents. Oops. $71,000 he made off of his patent with Smith & Wesson. Most of that was paid off. Well, not most of it. He started realizing that his boondoggle of money was being used up in lawyer fees. So he ended up giving the royalties to his wife. So they didn't have to keep paying so much of that. But he ended up paying over $17,000 in lawyer fees to hold his patent. And Smith and Wesson sitting back there laughing. We got it there. Smith and Wesson comes to Colt Firearms and says, hey, we will sell you this patent for $1 million. Well, the powers that be at Colt at that time considered it until they started doing research and found out there was a second patent of the same thing. Colt said, no way, Jose, get out of here. So it went on for a while that way. And finally, all the patents went out, and now we can start our cartridge revolvers. But in the meantime, Smith and Wesson, noting all that, started making cartridge revolvers of larger frame. So in 1870, there was a big guns trial that the Army Ordnance wanted. They wanted to go to this cartridge revolver. As you could about imagine, it'd be a lot handier to load the cartridge than it would a black powder pistol. Smith and Wesson had a gun, and Remington had 4 guns. Come to find out, Remington had an inside track in the War Department, 1 revolver, and like 3 other single shot, large bore rolling block pistols that were all played in trials. Well, Smith and Wesson really started the cartridge handgun revolution, if you want to call it that. Now, finally, the roll and white patent runs out. In 1872, yes, Colt presents to the Army their first entry in the cartridge revolver world. This is the 52 open top. It loads, side gate loading, put the cartridge in. Pretty cool gun. Army didn't like it. The top is open. They always claimed that the Colt had a tendency to flex at that point. They wanted to have a full frame around the cylinder. Just a couple months later, the famous single action Army of all time. They presented this, and within a year, trials were done. The Army awarded Colt the contract, but they wanted it, they offered it 44 caliber, the Army wanted it 45. So in 73, that year, the 45 long Colt or Colt ammunition was born, and the 73 single action Army. The Peacemaker. It had so many various nicknames. The most famous 6-shooter really in the world, and everywhere. Sold in the millions, actually. Had several runs clear up into modern times. Very nice gun, handles well, cocks well, it's very ergonomically designed. Quite the firearm. So there's that one. And there'll be more to that story here in a minute. Now then, we got 75. Remington needed to get in the game. So they came out with a cartridge revolver in 75. They called it single action Army, or improved Army, or frontier Army. They tried a lot of names to make it stick. Beautiful gun, works just like the Colt does, same, everything is pretty much the same. It never took off. They were 2 years behind Colt with their 73 single action. It just never took off. It's a great gun, fires well, very accurate, everything about it's good. It just never took off. The Colts were already there. So that's that one. Oh boy. Here's the big story. Well, Smith and Wesson, we're backtracking years a little bit to 1870. They presented the government with what they called the Model 3. That was their first gun in large frame, large caliber. The Army liked it. I said, man, look at this. So a general in the Army, currently, will come to me, John Scofield was a general in the Ordnance Department. He's got a brother, Major George Scofield, that's in the 10th Cavalry. He writes a letter to his brother and says, hey, man, you need to check out this gun that Smith and Wesson just gave us to look at. So George Scofield writes a letter to Smith and Wesson and says, I want to see this gun. Not only that, I want to be your agent in the West, in Kansas, in Colorado. I want to be your guy. So Smith and Wesson sends him one Model 3 and 500 rounds of ammunition. He gets looking at it, sells a few. That's a pretty nice gun, but it needs some improvement. So he starts working on some improvements of this Model 3 Smith and Wesson. And Smith and Wesson says, we're too busy. We have this massive contract with the Russians. We're building the Russian Model 3. This one actually is what they call a third model Russian. The interesting thing about the Smith and Wesson firearms, the reason why I've waited to tell you about the big difference between them, is with the Smith and Wessons, they were what they called an open top or a break top design. So you pop it open and you can see that extractor comes up and pops the cases out. That's a pretty cool design. Very handy. That's why Scofield was very interested in it. But he imagined his cavalry guys going, how am I supposed to hold on to the reins and do all this stuff and flip this up and do all this and make that work? So he made some changes to it, some design changes. And Smith and Wesson said, look, man, we are busy with the Russians. They had a contract for like 40 or 50,000 of these firearms. We're at capacity, we can't do anymore. If you want the changes made, find somebody to do them for you and we'll give them parts. So he did that. He did that exactly. Well, now they start introducing the improved versions to some of the troops. And they're saying, hey, this is pretty handy, actually. And through a lot of trials and lots of letters back and forth, and lots of all this kind of stuff, Scofield finally gets the attention of the War Department and is awarded a contract in 1875 for the third model Scofield. That's what we have here. Now, instead of lifting up, you flip back with your thumb here and it opens it up. That made all the difference in the world to the guy on horseback. So that's really cool. Let me read to you. That started a very big debate between all the officers of which was the better gun, the Colt or the Scofield. Now, Smith and Wesson had the ear of a rider. And this guy was, this account was written in September 24, 1876. And he was talking about the difference between the Colts and the Scofields, if you'll allow me. There are two pistols now in use in the cavalry, Colt and the Scofield Smith & Wesson. Both are breech loading arms and carry the metallic ammunition, but the similarity ends. I shall immediately demonstrate. After firing the Colt, the empty shells have to be punched out one by one with the ejector in the right hand, while the left is employed in slowly revolving the cylinder for that purpose. If, in turning the cylinder, the axis of the chamber passes a quarter of an inch beyond that of the ejector rod, the latter, in being pressed to the rear, brings up, not in the chamber as desired, but against the cylinder, and it has to be turned back again. This consumes valuable time, and the pistol isn't loaded yet. Another slow and equally tedious process has to be gone through with before that is accomplished. The cylinder has to be revolved again, and as but one of the empty chambers presents itself at a time, it has to be within hair's breadth of the exact position before the bullet will enter. It's almost impossible to reload it on horseback. It should be borne in mind that the hand which revolves the cylinder is the bridle hand, and while doing so is employed in guiding and controlling the motions of the horse. Now let's examine the nature of the operation of the Scofield Smith & Wesson and compare the two methods. After firing, it is passed to the bridle hand, which seizes it by the barrel, not around the cylinder, as is the case of the Colts. At the same time, the barrel latch is disengaged from the cylinder stay and the thumb and forefinger of the right hand, and by a simple turn of both wrists outward, the pistol is broken down, and with a movement like a piston on an engine, the extractor flies up, out go your 6 empty shells all at once. And there you have the empty chambers before you, ready for loading. You grab a handful of cartridges, fill the chambers without looking at them, a very important item. In the meantime, and the right hand again grasps the handle, and by simply turning it over with a flip of the right hand in front, the barrel latch re-engages the cylinder stay, and the pistol is ready for use again. What a contrast. This is easy and above all rapid proceeding presents the slow and tedious operation of the Colt. In order to test its facility of loading on horseback, the following trial was made. Taking the comparison Colt's pistol caliber 45, after a preliminary trial with each kind of pistol, an expert horseman was timed to see how long it would take him to eject 6 empty shells from this pistol and reload it. The cartridges were taken from a cap pouch on the belt. The horse was at hand gallop. The Colt's pistol began loading in 26 seconds, loaded in 60 seconds. Major Scofield's pistol began loading in 2 seconds, loaded in 26 seconds. The officers pointed out to the speed at which the Smith & Wesson could be loaded and reloaded to illustrate its great advantages over the Colt 45 single action army. Sounds like a glowing representation. So imagine you're on horseback and you got the bridle, you grab it by the barrel, you come this way and you flip it, boom, put them in, you're ready to go again. Pretty cool. Whereas the Colt,
Of course, you better have your gauntlet on. Wrap the barrel after you shot this and stuff.
yeah, might be a little warm. So here comes the big rub. The Army says, yeah, actually, we want these. So they ordered 3,000 Scofields, their first order. And before they even took delivery of the first order, they ordered another 3,000. But when they ordered them, they said, we need these to be in 45 Colt. Smith had already retired by then. D.B. Wesson says, well, the rim of the Colt cartridge doesn't really work with our extractor. They came out with what they called the 45 Scofield or the 45 Smith & Wesson. Okay, one problem. That round happened to be shorter than the 45 Colt. So it works in the Colt, but you can't put the 45 Colt in the Smith & Wesson. Now, how many of you have been in the Army? You know, supply chain is a nightmare in the Army. I never was in the Army, but I've been lots of supply chain issues. So you can imagine you're being out on the frontier and your whole unit is supplying to the Scofields, and they send you a whole wagon of 45 long full ammunition. That happens. This cracks me up, and I must share it. By the way, this is a great book. I got a lot of new information. Firearms, American West. This volume is volume 2, 66 to 1894. X had been ordered to send Captain Egan 5,000 rounds of Colt's revolver ball cartridges, and he did so. One blissful morning, the telegraph operator at the post darted into X with a dispatch from the chief ordnance officer at Omaha. Captain Egan reports that the cartridges you sent him will not fit his pistols. Uh-oh. 10 minutes after came another from Teddy himself. Cannot use the cartridges, all too long. Then in came the colonel, double uh-oh, with a dispatch from department headquarters and a perturbed expression on his face. Mr. X, what is the matter with the cartridges sent Captain Egan? The adjutant general is after us with sharp stick. X, meantime, summoned the ordnance sergeant, and that veteran glances over the papers and explains the matter in a dozen words. He's been trying to use the Colt's revolver cartridges in his Smith & Wesson, sir. And so it proved. The revolver ball cartridge is made to fit both the Colt and the Smith & Wesson, whereas Colt's revolver ball cartridge can only be used in the Colt. This information was telegraphed at once to the captain in the field, and the explanation wired to Omaha. But in the meantime, headquarters had been racked to its foundation at the discovery of so alarming of a nature. Dispatches had been sent all over the country to the cavalry company commanders, directing them to test their cartridges in the Smith & Wesson pistols. This, even though Scofield's brother, the one that's the general of the ordnance department, trying to save the Scofield name, made the Scofield cartridge the standard, it didn't go. And ultimately, the Army gave up on the Scofields. Too much of a nightmare with the ammunition. To me, this was a major mistake by Smith & Wesson. So they took all of the Scofields and a brokerage house in New York City bought them all up, cut 2 inches off the barrel, and sold them to Wells Fargo and Company and many police forces from around the world, and were used well into the 1900s. So they still saw a lot of use. But I often wonder, had Smith & Wesson been on top of the game and not so tied up in the Russian guns, and had beat Colt to the punch and with their 73 single action, if we would be holding this up and saying, this is the peacemaker, this is the gun that won the West, as far as handguns are concerned. Smith & Wesson had their hand in a lot of different things. They were in with Roland White and all of that nonsense. And there was some great controversies there. This is a great book to read about that. Colt, Smith & Wesson, A Clash of Arms. This talks about all the legal battles they had over the Roland White patents. A whole book written just on that. It's a fascinating read. If you ever get a chance to read it, find it. It is fascinating. I never thought there would be so many legal battles over patents of firearms in the day. But when you're talking millions of dollars in the 1800s, that's a lot of money to be made. So, did I cover that? Oh, one other thing. A little more. Now we're talking about single action weapons. we're talking about single actions. And does everyone know what that means? Is there anybody that doesn't know what that means? If you don't know what that means, the trigger performs one single action. In other words, you have to manually pull back the hammer, and then the trigger does one action. It drops the hammer. That's all it does. Double action, however, it cocks the hammer and drops the hammer. Now, the reason why I mentioned that, this slide here, in this picture caught my eye. The third gun down, you'll see a big gap between the trigger and the trigger lever. This was a double action trigger in 1870. And I wonder why they didn't push that to the War Department. Because if you're coming up on the Indians, and you're making war with the Indians, do you want this? Or do you want? See the difference? I never understood that. One other thing I'd like to share with you. A couple of ads for Colts guns. 14 reasons why to own a Colt. You can take the time to read them if you want. I'll just share with you number 10. If you buy a Colt's rifle or pistol, you feel certain that you have one true friend with 6 hearts in his body and who will always be relied on. There's some really humorous things. We don't think those ways today, but they do back then. That's all I have, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. If not, you're welcome to come up and take a close look at the firearms, and I thank you for attending. Hope you learned something. Questions? Yes.
So you said the most famous 6-shooter in the world? Is that the third model?
The Colt.
That was the Colt.
Yeah, the Colt single action arm.
Okay.
Yep, 73 Colt.
I was just wondering when this ad is from. What year?
This was in the late 50s, early 60s. I stumbled on these. They weren't in any of these books that I had. I stumbled on this just doing some searches on the internet. And someone had written an article about the 4 big manufacturers of firearms at this time period. And somewhere they had found some really great ads. And I couldn't help but try to read these ads because it just really fascinated me of how what they were trying to do to make you want to buy a Colt firearm. And some of the reasons why you want to do that. Yes, sir.
Can you explain real quick to everybody the Colt rifle?
Well, the Colt rifle was basically an extension of the Colt handgun. It was still a 6-shooter with a stock on it. So you loaded it, you did everything in the same motion, only you had a longer moment with the rifle and you were more accurate with it. But I don't know that it was any more powerful, maybe a little, because in a revolver, you have an air gap between the cylinder and the forcing cone of the barrel that leaks gases out. So I don't know that it would be that much more as far as speed is concerned. And that's where a rifle comes into play. And now, I forgot to mention on the 73 single action, Colt came out in 78 with what they call the Frontier model. And they offered that, their first offering of the Frontier model was 4440. Now, if you remember, that was the 73 Winchester's caliber. So now the operator could carry 2 guns with 1 ammunition. Now you say, well, what would be the advantage of doing that? It's the same thing. Would it be the same in the rifle and the pistol? No, not at all. Again, the pistol leaks gas. It's not efficient in the fuel usage. A lot of unburned powder comes out the end. It's still great, still has lots of punch, but a rifle is much more efficient in using the fuel at hand. So it's still expanding the gases and burning the gases all the way down the barrel. That makes it velocity much faster, and your aim is so much accurate because you have a longer moment of aim. So that's why in some instances, you want to use your rifle for something at distance that you really need to pinpoint. Maybe it's going to try to hit that rabbit over there or whatever. You're not going to hit it with your handgun, you're going to hit it with your rifle. That kind of thing. So that's another point. Any other? Yes, sir.
The Spencer 45 and the Spencer rifle take the same cartridge also?
So the Spencer lever action rifle is a 50 caliber.
Okay.
Now, that packed a lot more punch than the 44 rimfire that the Henry used. It's way more powerful. That's why there wasn't very many Henrys used in the Civil War, most of which were private purchase. The government did buy a few, but it wasn't like as many as what they bought with the Spencers.
In the Scofield, same story or did that one?
So the scroll with the Scofields, that was a 45 caliber, but it did not pack the punch that the 45 long Colt did, because it's a shorter case. The Colt used 30 grains of black powder, and the Smith & Wesson, I believe it was like 25 grains. So it was a slower bullet and didn't have the kind of wallop that the Army was looking for. So, and that was, again, its ultimate demise was the mix-up of ammunition. They'd have been so much smarter to just go with the Colt. You're in a machine shop. There's a factory. You can make an adjustment of your machine to fit that particular cartridge. But they were so mad. There was such a war between Smith & Wesson and Colt and trying to gain that market share that they were unwilling to bend just a little bit. Had they done that, they would have sold thousands and thousands and thousands of Scofields. I feel confident.
All right, well, thank you so much. Again, if you have any ideas of something you'd like to hear us talk about next year, please go ahead and let Nancy know and myself by email. We appreciate your kind attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. And you're welcome to take a look at the firearms.